Well, welcome to Don and Steve Plus. Good to have you with us as we're going to dive into a topic that I think a lot of us maybe have wrestled with, but kind of an interesting way to ask this question. But before we do, I need a little coffee
Okay.
because
gonna
without
join you.
without this coffee, I don't know that I'm going to get through this podcast.
It's true.
Because
Or any podcast.
that's
For
true.
that matter.
I do run on Raphael's Coffee and coffee in general, for that matter. You can check out Raphael's in the show notes, but all over the news as of late, we have seen lots of different headlines as it relates to the United States, Ukraine, Trump, Zelensky, all of that. We're not going to get into all of that.
Nope.
All right. That's a different podcast, not this one. But what that has done is it's caused some people to say, well, what's going on in Ukraine in the church? What's going on in Ukraine as it relates to faith? And one of the things that's I think is interesting is that there are people in Ukraine who say, yeah, the church has changed a lot over the last 3 years, all sorts of missions opportunities. There are people who are ripe and ready for the harvest, and so we do need workers there. But one of the things that I thought was fascinating was someone who's being interviewed about what happens now.
Sure.
He said, I hear people saying in the church that what has happened as of late might be meant to teach Ukrainians that they should not rely on America, but they should rely on God. We can see how God is using this to shift affections and hope in things.
Yeah.
And that got me thinking, like, man, is that not what so many of us have done with certain circumstances and challenges in our lives? We've looked for people to save us. We've looked for circumstances to change, and who do I know, and how can I maneuver this, and what can I do, instead of saying, hey, Lord, this isn't catching you by surprise.
Yeah.
Yeah. Am I the only one? Have you ever? Yeah. You're,
Man, I don't think you're the only one.
Yeah. Okay.
No. But so riddle me this.
Yeah.
From what do you want saved?
Well, I think very often it is all. Well, for me, most of the experience has been economic, right? Lord, I see a shortfall here. I need your help with this. God, you don't seem to be moving according to the timeline and the pressure that I feel. So what can I do to, close that gap, to go after this and pay these bills and whatever? For other people, it may be all sorts of different things. It could be relational things. I think of some relationships in my life where, like, God, I am asking you to change this in this relationship, and you're not fixing it. So what do I need to do to fix this, and how can I manipulate the situation and do that so that things work out the way that I want it to work out?
Sure.
Some of us maybe have kids who have walked away from God, and we're like, and instead of like, God, I know that this child you love him or her more than I do.
Right.
And so I'm going to wait on you to draw them to yourself. I'm going to continue to come before you, plead, and ask you to do this. But, I'm going to not try and fix and manipulate the situation anymore. So there could be all sorts of different things.
Yep. Those are big.
Yeah.
They're big things. I think when you talk about Ukraine and the United States or any other country that is relying on any other country for aid or rescue, and let's face it, the Ukrainians are tired.
Absolutely.
They are exhausted.
It's been 3 years.
3 long years. And I just recently read a book. It was fictional, but it was one of the historical fiction works.
Okay. Yeah.
And they were talking about World War II and just the constant bombing. It was set this one was set in England. So the constant bombing that was happening, and there was no safety, no place to go. And just how long, when you're in the middle of that, how long and weary you become. And you're watching these atrocities happen to people. And so the Ukrainians are tired. The church is weary. And that particular missionary in that article was talking about the churches in Ukraine that hunkered down and just kind of went inward to survive. they have not flourished. But the ones that have tried to feed and be available and bring in people who need refuge, like they are thriving because they were there for the community
Yeah.
and offering help in tangible ways. And so you look at that and you think about the question, where is it that we're looking for our rescue? And I'm like you, Steve. I'm looking at finances. I'm looking at kids. I'm looking at family members and friends that I know need the Lord or need the Lord to show up in a way that I have specified.
Yes. Yeah.
And I think when these big things happen, like war, obviously we want somebody to show up and help. Figuring out good guys and bad guys and all that thing, that always comes into that equation. And yet, for a believer, I remember, okay, let me go down this path a minute, because this whole conversation reminds me of something that I asked a listener back when I worked in radio. It was actually when we were serving radio together. And I asked a person who was upset about something when it comes to the United States and leadership and Christians. And my question was, if you're not an American, if you're not in the United States, can you be a Christian? And the response was, that's a good question.
Seriously?
Yeah. Or if you're not associated with a
Wow.
particular party, can you be a Christian? That's a good question. I'm like, wait, what?
Uh-huh. I think we need to talk about what is Christian then, if that's how we're answering that
Yes.
question.
And as a Christian,
Wow.
then the next question is, where do we place our trust? Because we wear our T-shirts that say, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. We can quote Jeremiah 29:11. And then I think of Proverbs 3, 5, and 6, right? Trust in the Lord with all your heart. And when I start quoting these two verses, I have to stop, because I'm like, okay, Dawn, what does that mean? All your heart. And then go on, lean not on your own understanding. So the ways that I want God to fix things for me, for my loved ones, is my understanding.
Right.
And Scripture tells me not to lean on that. Okay. Then what do? I've got to know what God has said, not maybe how he's going to fix that situation, because that's still a mystery if he hasn't gotten involved yet.
Yeah.
Or in a way we can see.
Yeah.
He's always working behind the scenes.
He is.
We forget that.
Yeah.
Oftentimes.
Oh, I can think of so many times in my life where God has been working behind the scenes, sometimes even before I was aware that there was an issue or a problem. And then all of a sudden, issue or problem surfaces, and you cry out to God, and God provides the answer, often in a way that I did not expect.
Sure.
And then you begin to kind of reverse engineer that, and you're like, wait a minute, God started working on this whole thing to allow it to play out the way it did before I even knew that there was going to be an issue.
Crazy.
It's so cool to see that.
Yes.
And when you see that happen in your life, especially if it happens more than once, you begin to say, okay, I don't know how you're going to move, God. I don't know what you're going to do, but I believe that you will.
Yeah.
And so I have faith. Lord, increase my faith.
Sure. I believe.
I believe,
Help my
right?
unbelief.
Exactly.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yeah. And I've been so aware in this last little season in my life that he wastes absolutely nothing. And sometimes I'll have kind of a flashback of something he did 30 plus years ago that at the time seemed like nothing. And now it's come back to where that was a preparation for a moment where he needed to sow something into my heart or mind that when the next situation came up, he could remind me, remember what I did back then?
Yeah.
Look at this right now and know I'm the same. I have not changed at all. So when you start breaking these things down and not just wearing them on a T-shirt, it's a way different thing. Now, we may wear it because we really believe it.
Sure.
And I do believe that's the point of wearing something like that. But if we're not willing to slow our roll and start to identify, like, Lord, here's my prayers, and here's my fixes.
Yep.
Go ahead. Instead of, it's almost like, Lord, we're here for you, not you're here for us. That's really a different. That's a different level of faith.
It is. And it's a different level of faith. It's a totally different mindset than even what is often talked about in Christendom. I think of how many times that we pose questions that are me-centric and God in them
Yep.
instead of God-centric with me in them.
Sure.
And, there are times that are like, all right, Lord, what do you have for me today? Lord, what do you want me to do today? And I understand why we ask those
Oh, yeah.
questions, right? But sometimes, and I was reminded of this when I went through the Experiencing God course a couple of times a few years ago.
Nice.
So often the question that we should be asking him is, God, what are you doing?
Yep.
And what does it look like for me to align with you?
Sure.
God, where are you moving? And where is there an invitation for me to step in to what you're doing and where you're moving so that I can be a part of what you're doing? Not, Lord, here's my plan, here's my fix. Would you do it? And then if you don't, then I end up getting irritated and
Of course.
angry that
Yep.
God didn't fix my problem the way I wanted him to.
Losing my faith because you didn't fix what I wanted you to, or that pain is so difficult. And you can't dismiss pain. Pain is real.
Yeah.
And oftentimes we say, Lord, where are you in the pain? When you're looking at this war that's happening in Ukraine, if you're looking at the war that's happening in your own life, and we want somebody to come to the rescue. And if God doesn't come running in on his white horse and do it the way we want to, I remember a boss telling me one time, Dawn, you think somebody's going to run in on a white horse and fix this, and that's not going to happen. And I was like, why not?
Yeah.
It's so clear. And yet he was right. But it was very disappointing. And I had to go back to the Lord and go, then where are you? And where do you want me to join you in this? How do you want me to continue down the path that I believe you've called me to if somebody's not going to fix it? Because you're still God. The call is still to serve you. How can you strengthen me through this? How can you give me a mindset that trusts in you with all my heart, and I'm not going to lean on my own understanding? And then help me acknowledge you so that you'll make my path straight. That's finishing out those 2 verses of Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. That mindset, Steve, I have to go back and keep reciting the truth over and over, because the minute I stop thinking about it, that's the minute I go, trust in me with all my heart and lean on my own understanding. And even though I know the scripture is saying the opposite of that, my behavior starts to go over toward a self-fixing or self-fulfilling prophecy. And I'm wondering, do you think that, like, I've told you before, I like NCIS, the television show NCIS.
Yeah.
Do you think it's because we're waiting for the good guy to come in and save the day? Because we watch stuff like that where usually the good guy kind of wins?
I think sometimes that is the case. And I think we also, just as a people, have a sense of justice.
Sure.
And so when we feel injustice, and especially if that has been perpetrated against us, or at least that's our perception, is we've suffered injustice, we want justice. There's something in us that cries out, yeah, I want justice. And so I want that rider on the white horse to roll in here and to do and that day is coming. But in the meantime, in the here and now, my heart longs for that. We still desire that justice. And sometimes I think we live in the tension of, or at least I do, live in the tension of, okay, I know that God can change this if he wants to.
Sure.
He could change it just like that if he wants to. And so how do I sit in the tension of, God, I know you can, but I don't know if you will. I struggle sometimes with so are you asking me to do something? Is there a step I'm supposed to take?
Sure.
Is there something that you're inviting me to do that I'm missing? Or are you just asking me to patiently wait on you right now? And I think sometimes that's part of my struggle, is knowing, all right, Lord, are you just asking me to sit and wait? Or is there something that you're asking me to do right now that I'm not quite picking up on?
Yep.
Like when is he asking me to be proactive, and when is he asking me to wait on him?
So of late, when you've asked that question, because I know this is applicable to recent weeks and months in your life.
Yeah.
How have you discerned, and maybe even in hindsight, what do you see where the Lord may have been asking you to wait and you didn't, or he did ask you to wait and you did, and now you see how he's answered a prayer?
Yeah. One of the big ones that was, and we've talked about this in the podcast before. We used to do this radio show, and that went away. And with that went the income for that radio show. And, God stepped in and he provided a job and means and all these things. And like we were super, super confident that that was God's provision and that was a yes, a thing to say yes to. But there's still a gap. And as we prayed about that, and what are we going to do? And Lord, what would you have us do? And both Susie and I just felt the Lord impressing upon us, wait. We'd pray about it again, wait. Pray about it again, wait. And this phrase came up like, don't chase the gap. Over and over and over again, we seem to get it not only in times of prayer and trying to listen to him, but just people in our lives and circumstances. And we're like, okay, we believe God is asking us to just sit and wait on him, and he is going to move when he chooses to move.
And you waited.
And we waited.
And you chose to listen to what he was telling you.
Yeah, yeah. And the prayer then became, all right, Lord, we're going to sit and wait for you to show up. And you're going to decide to move when you decide to move. Give us the faith and the patience and the wisdom to wait well. And so we sat and waited, in a sense. And then he moved. And he moved in such a way that it was so out of the blue that we're like, all right, that is him. That is clearly him.
Exactly.
And so then you're able to say yes to that because it was so clearly him. It wasn't me doing what I would have been tempted to do or have done in the past of being, oh my goodness, what are we going to do now? How are we going to pay for this? And how are we going to do that? And what's going on here? And, this bill is going to come due. And are we going to have to tell the kids that they have to stop drum lessons and taekwondo and all the things, right? And God just said, wait, I got you. When the time's right, you'll know it because I'm going to show you clearly that the time is right. And he did. And it's cool. It's just another one of those things where it continues to build faith. Like, yeah, Lord, help me to never doubt you again.
That and doubt is such a thing that's easy for us to do. But as he builds that faith, you do remember that we mentioned Ebenezer stones because in the Old Testament, the Lord will set up a stone of remembrance. Called a journal if you want to. So you can go back and see God's faithfulness. This is where he met me, even if it's peace. I mean, that's not something that's super tangible on the outside, but it certainly is on the inside. And then to see how he provides. And the other fascinating thing about that is if the season came to where the Lord asked you to lay down taekwondo and drum lessons, then the faith to say, okay, Lord, it's yours. And you would have. I know you guys. You totally would have done that if that was his direction. If he would have said, in the meantime, because you were sitting with him and trusting him and knowing his faithfulness.
Yeah.
So I find that the more you hear him and you're still when he says be still, or you take those action steps, because the other thing you think about is people that he instructed in the Old Testament. Joshua comes up and the first thing God calls him to do is go march around this city and shout with the Israelites. So he had to lead these people into something that I guarantee you that made no sense to them.
It makes no logical sense, does it?
It sure doesn't to us in 2025. But I doubt it made much sense to them either. And yet that was God's call, and that's what they faithfully did, and not knowing at all what he was going to do with them marching around that city.
Yeah.
And yet they followed his instruction to march. You followed his instruction to wait. We follow his instruction when we see it in his word, and we're seeking him, not just the answer to and I think that's where it gets really to be a struggle, a deep struggle, especially if you're looking at health. You're looking at a child. You're looking at pain and physical harm and things that we don't have answers for.
Right.
And we say we live in a fallen world, and we know that.
We do, yep.
But that doesn't fix anything. Because it goes back to that sense of justice in us.
Yeah.
So how do we trust the Lord in a broken world, waiting, marching, moving, when I think it's the art of spending time with him,
Right.
listening to him, getting into scriptures, aligning our hearts, which is what you were talking about, aligning our hearts with his, and see how he might use our lives while we're here,
Yeah.
because we ain't going to make it alone.
Well, and it's interesting you bring up Joshua. I was thinking about him recently. Like, God asked him to do this thing that makes no logical sense.
Mm-hmm.
But you look at why would Joshua have said yes to that? And you look at how God prepared Joshua
Mm-hmm.
for that. He was Moses' apprentice.
Mm-hmm.
He had the front row seat to so many of the things that God did for the nation of Israel through Moses. Moses would go up the mountain to meet with God, and Joshua would go up with him. Not necessarily to the top, often it's not all the way up there, but Moses would come down, and Joshua would join him, and back to camp they'd go. Moses would go to the tent of meeting and meet with God there and hear from God. And who was with him? Joshua.
Sure.
And when Moses would leave, and who would stay back there at the tent of meeting? Joshua.
Mm-hmm.
So many different things that Joshua was right there for. Got to see God move, got to see him at work. And so, and there's I'm forgetting exactly where in scripture it is right now, but it also talks about the fact that the Spirit of God was on Joshua.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And so now when Joshua is asked to do something that makes no sense whatsoever, I'm sure he looks back and says, yeah, that doesn't make sense, but didn't make sense when God told Moses strike a rock and water came out.
Yeah.
Didn't make sense when God told Moses do this and the Red Sea parted. Didn't make sense.
Right.
All these different things, right? But why did Joshua have the faith to do that?
Mm-hmm.
Like, because God had prepared him and showed him who he is.
Mm-hmm.
So the thing that I'm challenged with with that is, am I looking at who God is?
Right.
Am I spending time in his word enough that when he asks me to do something that it feels uncomfortable, doesn't make sense, whatever, I'm like, okay, because I know who you are.
Yeah. Well, in that same passage, we learn about Rahab, who we don't know much about her faith journey, and yet we know that she had faith to hide the spies.
Yeah.
Put the scarlet thread or scarlet
Rope
out her window so that they would know when they came in to conquer the city that she was someone of faith. We know very little about her faith journey, but God gave her enough faith to do the things that he needed her to do for that season and time. And don't you know, she grew in faith after that. We only get just a picture, just a little snapshot of her faith as opposed to Joshua's. But how amazing that, again, God, in his beautiful timing, prepares. She wasn't thinking that the spies are going to show up at her house that day.
Sure.
She was going about her regular business, which, by the way, was a very broken business. And the Lord said, this one's mine.
Yeah.
I've got a plan for you. Today is your day. So to think that he's limited, we're selling him so short, and we're missing out
Right.
on what he's already done. We're missing out because we're busy telling him what we think he should do when he's got such a better plan.
Oh, that's so good. I sometimes have that question that comes to mind. How many things have I missed that God would have done had I waited?
Mm-hmm.
What are the things that I would have seen him do and the experiences that I could have had with him, but I decided to take things into my own hands? Yeah.
That's a whole
I don't even want to know right now.
podcast. I know, right? We won't know.
Yeah.
Thankfully, that's grace too, to not tell us or show us this side of eternity what we missed or what we messed up on. I mean, some things by default we know we messed up.
Yeah.
But what we missed, what grace
Yeah.
to say, and then ultimately to bring us home. It all starts with that relationship with Jesus. It all starts there, acknowledging our sin and knowing that we can't do anything about that sin nature, and we all have it. So on our website, we have given more information about that key relationship, the one that impacts all of eternity for each one of us. So DawnandStevePlus.com is where you're going to find more about how to know Jesus. You'll find out more about the show. Even in the show notes here, wherever you're listening or watching the podcast, we have all kinds of ways to connect, whether it's to Raphael's Roastery or Dawn and Steve, or even articles that we talk about. We always put those in the show notes. So thank you so much. Thanks for being our plus one.